Hi, welcome back. I'm here to give you my fall TBR. So this is a combination of the horror books I'll be reading for Halloween, as well as my TBR for Space Opera September. If you missed my announcement video, I will have it linked down below. Basically, for the month of September, we're going to be reading space opera books. It's really accessible, even if you're a newbie to the genre. And as well, we're going to be talking about some fantasy and some other dark fiction books that I'll be reading over these next few months. So this is going to be covering most of the books from September to November. And it's not all the books I'm going to be reading. I'll mention a few review copies, but there's definitely going to be others because I just did a book haul, so I'm going to try not to be too repetitive here. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about the books I'll be reading in relation to my Patreon book club. I always have a link down below if you want to join, but no pressure at all. The first thing is that my top tier patrons now have the option to nominate a book for my seasonal TBR. So once every quarter, they get to nominate a book, and then I put those books into a number generator, and when one of them gets selected and added to my TBR, this season it couldn't be more perfect. The book that got selected is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I'm really hoping to focus on reading more horror classics this season, and so it worked out perfect that that was one of the nominations and the one that won. I know very little about this book. I believe it's about a woman who goes to a manor. There's a man who has a deceased wife and things go from there. I believe it's gothic horror, it's classic. It's a kind of book that years ago I would have thought I could never love. I used to be very afraid of anything literary or character driven, but these days I'm really finding my taste change. So I am trying to keep my expectations in check, but honestly I'm pretty excited for this one. I'm pretty hopeful that it'll be a favorite, and it seems like the perfect time of year to read something like this. Next, for the month of September, it is a horror month, so we're going to be reading Joyland by Stephen King. For those that haven't joined my book club, it's good to know that we typically don't read Stephen King. I usually veto him from my list only because there are 1,000 other book clubs out there that read Stephen King every single month. And while I appreciate some of his works, I don't want to only read Stephen King with my book club. But every once in a while I do allow it. The theme for September was carnival horror, and knowing that Joyland is such a popular book, I wanted to give the opportunity for that to get nominated, and sure enough it ended up winning, which I'm really excited about because it's one of my most anticipated Stephen King books. It's one that I really think I'll love because it's a coming of age horror book. I love the idea of a carnival setting set in the summer, and I think I'm gonna like it. A few people recommended that to me based off the fact that I was fairly positive in my review of Later, also by King, so we shall see. But again, it seems like the perfect time of year to read something like carnival horror, the end of summer, all of that. So hoping I'm gonna love it. I'm gonna say that for every book on this TBR. I'm sorry. And then for October, we'll also be reading horror, and for that, we'll be reading The Cold Moon Over Babylon by Michael McDowell. I've never read this author before, and I will be frank that that is probably because I've always been really nervous to read Southern horror, but that's the theme for this month's book club, and so it just seemed like the right time for it. It's a book that won by a landslide, and I'm obviously hoping I'm gonna love it because that book is a bit of a booktube darling on Horror BookTube, and I'm nervous because, again, I'm from Canada, I'm not from the South, so I'm hoping I'm gonna have a connection to those aspects of the story, but it's so beloved that I'm really, really desperate to love it too. And then in the month of November, we're going to be reading a science fiction book, but at the time of recording this, that hasn't been picked yet, so you'll have to stay tuned once that book gets announced. So moving on to horror books I plan to read for myself, I want to read a lot of classics. I've been noticing that there are some just gaps in my reading. For someone who reads as much as I do, it is surprising to other people and myself. There's certain really popular, beloved books that I just haven't gotten to yet. And so I'm really trying to change that this year. So the first one is a book I said I would never read, and I'm taking it back. I'm allowed to do that. I did a video earlier in the year where I talked about horror books I never planned to read, and while I stand by most of the books in that video, I included Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and so many people in the comments really encouraged me to give it a chance, especially because it is a horror slash science fiction crossover. It really is the foundations of the science fiction genre, and we're really surprised that I wasn't even going to give it a try. I'm nervous to read this one. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to work for me, but I am going to give it a try, and if I read it through, I will let you know. Let me know if you want a review or a vlog for that. I feel like it's such a beloved classic. I don't know if I'm going to have much more to say, but I'll at least give you a reaction in a wrap-up video, so stay tuned for that. If I finish it, you will know and we will talk. Next is another classic, and that is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. I've never read her before, and I feel like this is the iconic place to start. I don't know a lot about it. I believe it's about a brooding vampire telling their story through interview style, and it's the kind of book that I do want to read because it is a classic. I am finding that I do like some vampire stories, but I've also had people tell me that they think I'm gonna hate it, knowing my taste in books. I do worry I'm gonna find the main character really annoying and whiny, but maybe it'll work. Sometimes I just can't even predict my own taste in books. I just have to try them. And again, it's such a classic that even if I don't entirely love it, I do think that as a reviewer, I do need to have a comprehension or understanding of what some of these classics are, because often people ask and say, oh, is this book like Interview with the Vampire? And I need to know what that book is about. I need to experience it for myself to make that comparison. So again, even if it's not a favorite, I'm not going to regret reading it just because I want to have that understanding so I can hopefully be a little bit better as a reviewer in making those comparisons and contrasts. Next up is The Library at Mount Char. This is a book I recently talked about in my book haul because I was gifted an audiobook copy of it. And since recording that video, I still don't really know what this book is about. And so it's one that I'm going to go into very blind, and I'm really looking forward to giving it a try and seeing if it works for me. Again, maybe I can finally give the world a good synopsis of what the book's about after finishing it, because no one on the internet seems to be able to explain it to me in a way that I understand. I know it's weird, it's horror, it's fantasy, it's like nothing else, and I just have to try it for myself. So again, I'll keep you posted once I get through it. I also want to read a thriller called Last Rituals. I don't even remember how this book got on my TBR, but I've been dying to read it. It's an Icelandic mystery novel that follows this person who is being found, I believe it's a student who is found murdered in this really horrific way that appears to be tied in with a satanic cult. And then we follow the police as they're investigating what's happening. Something about anything involving satanic cults just piques my interest, and I happen to have a love for fiction written and taking place in Iceland. It's an area of the world I've been fascinated by. I would love to travel there. I don't have plans anytime soon, so for now I have to explore it through my fiction, although arguably I don't think I'd want to explore a murder in Iceland, so maybe that will help me to kind of stave off my excitement to go there for a little bit. But I don't know why. Again, I haven't heard anyone talk about this book online. I have no idea how I found it on Goodreads, but I've been dying to read it, and I think now is the season for that. Next is a piece of true crime, and that is People Who Eat Darkness by Richard Lloyd. This is a book that has been on and off my TBR for years now. It's an older piece of nonfiction that follows, well, older relatively, of course. It's, not a brand new release, that follows the case of a woman who was murdered in Japan. Japan has a relatively low murder rate, and there was a journalist who followed the case and wrote a piece about it. I am particularly interested to read this one because I read the author's other work, Ghosts of Tsunami, earlier this year, which is all about the horrific tsunami that happened. And that book floored me. I was sucked in. It was one of the most immersive pieces of journalist writing I have read in quite some time. And of course, I didn't review it on my channel because it's not really my niche, so I don't always talk about every book that I read on here. But this one is true crime, so I think it fits well enough into my channel, and I do want to revisit it. I've heard, I think again, like I maybe read the first chapter years ago, and I remember it being a little bit dry and dense, but again, I was a different reader back then. I do find myself wanting to revisit things that didn't work for me, things that I put aside, 8 years ago to see if they work for me now, and I've just been dying to get through this one because this other book about the tsunami just haunted me. I don't mean, pun not intended, that book is just haunting, and I really want more from that journalist's work. And I also recently talked about some books that I was gifted, particularly this stack of books that came from a subscriber, Sabrina. And of this list, obviously I want to read all of them, but my top priorities are Rust and Stardust, which is again a story very similar to Lolita, drawing from the original crime that Lolita was inspired by, as well as I think top of my list would also be Eileen, because it's supposed to be really dark and messed up, and I do tend to crave these really creepy, weird type of stories more in the fall winter season, so I'm going to try to get to this one pretty soon. Then for new releases, I talked about it recently, but I want to be reading The Dead Take Train A by Chrisanda Kaw and Richard Cadney, and this of course is cosmic horror that involves magic set in the city, and it just sounds really cool. There's also a book coming out from Christina Henry, Good Girls Don't Die, I believe is the title, and that is one I'm really excited for because I do consider her to be one of my favorite authors, and so I will read anything that she writes at this point. There's also a book called Becoming the Boogeyman, which is by Richard Chismar, and this is a sequel, prequel to Chasing the Boogeyman, which is the book I was obsessed with when it came out. So I have high hopes that this one will be a favorite too, because that was of course a true crime coming of age story that felt very meta because the author infused himself into the story as a character and you kind of almost didn't know what was real or what was fake. And I'm a sucker for that kind of story. If you know anything like that I haven't read, please let me know down below. Next, let's talk about science fiction, which honestly this video is going to be mostly focused around books I'm going to be reading for Space Opera September. Again, check out the announcement video if you want more, but we're going to be reading books for the month of September that focus on space opera. And so I do recommend going through and checking out all the challenges. I have mapped out how I am going to explore the galaxy, and I kind of know what I'm going to read, but this could change, so I'm just going to put that disclaimer out there. So don't hold me to this as my final TBR. It still could change, but this is what I think I'm going to read. First off, I didn't mention it in my book haul, but I received copies of the latest Murderbot books. The next one is coming out, I think, November. So my goal is to reread the first novellas and then catch up to these and then be all ready for the newest book to come out. And I'm excited for that. Now I do realize I've read Murderbot, or All Systems Red, before the first one, which is technically not set on a ship, it is set on a planet. So I believe that some of the later books will be set on a ship, so it should count towards Space Opera September. Maybe I've made a horrible mistake, but I believe that's true. So some of these books should count within there and kind of fulfill some of the challenges. Another series that I want to go and revisit and return back to is the Honor Harrington series by David Weber. I love the first book and I've read a few more in the series, but because the series is so long, I keep starting it and stopping it and promising to come back to it when I have time. But I think this is a great chance to return back to this world. I love Honor Harrington as a strong female military character, and her cat-like alien companion is just to die for. I adore this series and I really want to come back to it, so I'm going to include some of those. I'm planning on starting back at the beginning and then just kind of binging through and see how far I can get throughout the month and just read a whole ton of books and plan to do it that way. Also, I plan to do the Wormhole Challenge, which allows me to read some graphic novels. And so my plan is I'm probably going to go with a reread of Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. I've read up to the newest volume back when they first came out, and then there was a huge gap in the publication. And then the latest one came out, and I promised myself I would read it. I got it out from Hoopla, the library app, and it just had been so long that I found myself kind of not being attached to the characters or the storyline, or kind of forgetting where it was left off. And so I think I'm going to love it so much more if I go back to the beginning, and again, you see where this is going, binge all the way through 1 through 9 and then read volume 10 right when it's fresh on my mind, because I do love that series. And so I just want to experience the volumes in the best way so I have the best chance of loving where the series is going from here. So that's the plan too. And then the last book I want to read for Space Opera September is The Stars Are Legion by Cameron Hurley. This is a book I read years ago. It was my first introduction to Cameron Hurley, and honestly one of the first science fiction books I read, and I don't think I really knew what I was getting myself into. Again, my tastes were different, and Cameron Hurley's books are just weird. They're strange, they're different, and it just wasn't what I expected. And so I actually gave it a pretty low rating, and I've talked about that recently in a video where I wish I loved that book a little bit more than I did. Since then, I've read their Married Empire trilogy, loved it, and I went on to read The Light Brigade, love that too. So I'm really convinced that as the reader I am now, I think I'm actually gonna love The Stars Are Legion. So many people have said that they're surprised I don't love it because it involves body horror, queer romance, and all of these things that just typically are things that tick off boxes. It's so unconventional, it's so weird. I think about it now and I'm like, why did I not give it 5 stars? So I'm convinced I read it at the wrong time in my life. I'm going to reread it and see if that feeling changes. I'm really excited for it, and I hope I love it as much as I think I will, so stay tuned there. Last, quickly mention a few more sci-fi books. One is The Djinn-Bot of Shantyport by Sept Basu. This is one that I recently talked about in my book haul, and I want to check it out when it is going to be released. I don't know if it counts for Space Opera September, but I adore this author, and I have high hopes that this one will be a favorite of the year. And also talked about in my book haul, I did get Children of Dune, so if I haven't read it by the end of August, I'm going to be picking up this for September and finishing out the original trilogy. I think I'm supposed to stop here, so let me know if I should go any further than that, because I've heard that this is as far as I should go. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I will stop here and not dabble into anything further into the Dune universe. And I'm just going to briefly mention some fantasy I'm interested in reading. The first one is Middle Game by Shauna McGuire. I want to read this one because I think it fits well into the spooky season. I think it involves kind of dark magic and it's kind of a crossover between horror and fantasy and so forth. And I don't know, again, it just seems like the spooky season to do it, but I don't know too much of the plot, I'll be fully honest. Another book I'm excited to read is a review copy, and that is After the Forest by Kelly Woods, which is a story that involves what happens after the fairy tale ends. And I really love that idea there. I think that's going to be really interesting. This one comes out in September, so I'll be reading it very soon. And then I think a lot of you will be excited to see this is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldee. I, like so many other readers, really enjoyed Legends and Lattes. I fully admit that I lean towards more dark, heavy fantasy, but that one's just really enduring. It's really cozy, and I'm excited to continue on with this universe. I believe this is more of actually a prequel, and it follows more kind of companion characters, but this premise of this one sounds very much up my alley. Of course, like bookshops and all that, I'm right there for. And so I'm hoping I'll love this one possibly even more than the first one. We shall see. And I also want to read City of Stairs by Robert Jackson Bennett. I believe this is a political fantasy where there are 3 books in the trilogy, but each one kind of jumps through time and kind of can be read as a standalone companion novel. And so I'm interested in this one because I really adored Foundry Side, and I've always meant to read more of the author's long form fiction. And this one again is one that's been on my TBR for a really long time. Typically when I like an author, I will try to read all of their backlists right away, but for various reasons I ended up kind of holding off and not reading these earlier. So again, books that I'm hoping you'll see on my end of the year favorites list. I've kind of marked it in there as a possible as I write out that list, but obviously I need to read it first, and hopefully it will live up to those expectations because I really liked Foundry Side. I know this one is totally different, but I think I could love it too. Another book I'm dying to read is Heroes Die by Matthew Strover, and this is one I want to read mostly because of the author. He has written some of my favorite Star Wars tie-in books. I absolutely love the books that he's written for the novelizations, and so I'm really interested to see what he will do on his own or has already done, because everything else I've read, of course, is a pre-existing world where he's forced to kind of work within those parameters or boundaries. And I've heard that this book is really gritty. I've heard that despite how the cover is not gorgeous, the book itself is fantastic, and a lot of people argue that's very underrated and not as well known or loved because the cover is kind of a turnoff. I don't know why it doesn't get a re-release considering it's become such an underground booktube darling, but I know Patrick has been gushing about this book for a while, and given my love for dark gritty fantasy, I'm hoping I'll love it too. And I also want to read through the series of The Wandering Inn, which is a series that I heard about from Matt's Fantasy Reviews. I'm going to link his channel down below, and he's been gushing about this urban fantasy where we follow this girl Erin who gets transported into this other world. She finds herself as this innkeeper and has to learn to survive. It's kind of a lit RPG where she's leveling up, so it feels a lot like a video game. I have started the first book, but as you know, if you know the series, it's very, very long, like over 1,000 pages. And so I haven't actually finished it at the time of recording this. And I think there's, I want to say 7 or 8 books that are now published in this web series. I know that you can read further along if you read the actual, web version, but I do want to catch up, and I'm thinking of doing a series review depending on how far I get into it and how much I like it. But I've been really focusing this year on reading big books, and so there is never a better time to read a series like this because it's known for being ridiculously long with a ridiculously long page count. So I want to read through it as much as I can, and then I can come back and let you all know if it's worth your time and so forth. So I'll keep you posted there, and we'll talk soon. And last, I do want to get into a little bit of manga this year. I'm just going to try it out, see if it's interesting to me, but don't worry, I know there's a lot of kind of negative feelings on BookTube about booktubers kind of dabbling into other mediums, but I am curious to try some One Piece, so I'm going to try that. I also want to try some other ones, perhaps some favorites like Death Note or Full Metal Alchemist. So if you have any recommendations or favorites down below, please drop them in the comments. Again, it wouldn't be something that would be taking away from my normal booktube content. If I do anything extra, it'll be like a Monday manga thing that I do occasionally, but who knows? I have to try it out and see how much I like it. I'm not going to commit to any content before I give the books a try. So that's kind of the general plan for the fall, is just kind of trying new avenues, trying new things, and keeping my reading life fresh, basically. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know down below, what do you think of the books I'm planning to read? Do you think I'm going to love them, hate them? I want your feedback and guesses. What are you planning on reading this fall? And if you're participating in Space Opera September, I want to know that too. If you're new to my channel, this is pretty representative of what I read, so I appreciate if you want to stick around and subscribe. You can also give me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment with this video. Even if just an emoji like a pumpkin or a spaceship, all of that is great. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.